The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Peter.
Good day, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you again. We're here at the How CDOs Succeed webinar that we run regularly from the International Society of Chief Data Officers, and we're so excited to have part two of our Doug Laney presentation. If you were with us a couple weeks ago, you know, he did a great bit on his Infonomics book that he's been working on, working from for a while. Doug, if you don't know him, I've got his bio up in front of you. He's been a friend and colleague for many, many years. He does almost everything you could think of on this in terms of consulting, putting out as a thought leader, lecturing at various universities and things like that, and working on books during the pandemic on this. And today, the topic is really about how to make a business case for the CDO. And Doug, we're so excited because this is some new material that you really haven't shared very broadly with a lot of others yet. So welcome to the presentation, Doug, and I will pass it over to you.
Thanks, Peter. Great to be with you all again. And let me see what I want to share here. Just a window. There we go. Yeah, I'm only what like 10 books behind you, Peter. Is that right?
If you count all the academic stuff, yes.
Yeah.
There's books that get read and books that don't get read, Doug. Let's just put it that way.
All right. Anyway, good morning, everyone from Chicago. I'm here just a few blocks from Wrigley Field. As soon as our son went off to university, we made a beeline back to the city and really enjoy all the vibrancy here. Thanks again to Peter and Robert for inviting me to speak at one of the ISCDO events. I know we're all looking forward to resuming in-person events as soon as possible. I think I'm just going to hug everyone I see when that happens, because I really miss all the face-to-face interaction. So let's jump in. So as any good kind of scientist knows, and any good data scientist should know, most discoveries begin with a hypothesis. We see a lot of surveys about data scientists that have to do with their role, but don't really have much of a point to make or a question to ask. I took, which is ironic, consider that's a survey about data scientists. So I took a bit of a different approach. I wanted to find out whether companies that have CDOs operate differently than other organizations. I wanted to know if these organizations benefit in any way. What kind of different behaviors do they exhibit, and ultimately, is the CDO really making a difference? It's easy to lay out the job and various responsibilities for a CDO, but it's proven difficult for many organizations to make the business case for one in the first place. The findings that I'm about to share with you come from surveys of over 500 organizations to date. We're running a continuous study also to look for changes over time, and I'll share those perhaps at next year's event. Listen, I'm not the first one to tell you that correlation doesn't equal causation. Therefore, I'm only going to share with you findings where there's really an extreme difference in organizations that have a CDO versus that don't have one. One might ask, is it reasonable to assume that someone other than the CDO is driving these data-related improvements in a company that has a CDO, or that companies already exhibiting these kinds of behaviors are the ones that hire CDOs? In my experience, no, neither of those kind of postulates are very likely. So come to your own conclusions about how strong a business case these findings are. I think it's a pretty good one, especially when we combine this kind of empirical data with our own reasoning, about the role. So the first, let's take a look at enterprise, at the enterprise as a whole. Everyone talks about becoming data-driven, but do they and their organizations really embody or embrace this at an enterprise level? When we take a look at corporate strategies, we find that only about 50% even make mention of the importance of data and analytics. Almost all strategies make mention of the importance of their core assets, of course, their financial and assets and production of goods and services and human capital. But these things are all things that show up on financial statements. So if you saw my last talk, what doesn't show up on financial statements, and that is data assets. As I've discussed and written about the past decade, data is not yet considered a balance sheet asset by current accounting standards, and data is not even fully acknowledged as property by the law. Therefore, it's easy to understand why it's overlooked in annual reports. But some companies do get it. Not that they quantify the value of their data as an actual asset, but they understand its value at some level and find it worth featuring as part of their corporate strategy. Now, is there any difference in organizations that do consider data versus analytics, or data and analytics as part of their enterprise strategies versus those that don't? It seems it's not just lip service. These businesses and other organizations claim to make significant use of their data 3 to 4 times more often. This is not 3% or 30%. This is 300% more often. Wait, here's, I got a slide on that. There we go. So vision really starts at the top, and it doesn't get much higher than those putting their names on the annual report or corporate strategy. So who's involved in this? In driving these high-level strategies and mentioning data and analytics, it seems to be the CDO. But of course, talking about data and analytics to shareholders isn't really the same thing as actually doing it. So let's talk about that. What does doing data and analytics entail? Many CDOs and other leaders talk about transformation. We're transforming our business or our relationships or our customers or suppliers, or transforming our products and services, or even transforming the market itself. So let's look at the top 3 ways that organizations are using data for transformation. Primarily, they're using data for strategic insights and decision making, and I suppose one can debate whether that's transformative in and of itself or not. 30% say they're using data to improve business performance. I suppose the degree to which you're improving business processes could be transformative if you do it well. That is, if you integrate data and analytics into the business processes themselves, typically with the help of some sort of AI or automation. And next, we see that a scant 17% see that they're truly transforming business processes, products, and services with their data. I think further study would reveal what these use cases are, but over the years, I've actually compiled 500 real-world use cases, examples of organizations using data and analytics for innovative and high-value purposes, most really which are transformative, if not in an enterprise level, for some particular business function. And Peter made mention that I'm working on another book. That book is going to be a compilation of 100 real-world examples of how organizations are using data and analytics, with commentary on each use case by an industry expert like Peter and others. So, one example would be Wichita State University. It's transformed the way that it accepts applicants, not based on grades or scores or interviews, but rather on matching the particulars about the individuals with the program's course requirements and curriculum. And what this has led to is fuller courses, greater student success, and higher revenues for the university. Or there's Vestas, which builds and installs wind turbines, and they now use supercomputing-based forecast models that take into account 200 variables and 20 petabytes of weather data to identify the precise optimal turbine placement within a 10 square meter grid, versus what they used to do manually is really only optimize it within a 27 square kilometer grid, previously possible. They can now determine the placement of these wind turbines in 15 minutes versus over 3 weeks previously. Or there's the story of the city of Malmo in Sweden, their police department that reduced 9 months of manual analysis of crime data, such as communication behavior from phone calls, in combination with crime statistics and weather of day of week, city events, and millions of interrogations, down to 3 minutes of automated analysis, which actually helped them identify and locate a serial killer. So anyway, just a few of the examples that I'll be featuring in the book. And the book is meant to be inspirational, not necessarily instructive, but inspirational to business leaders who are looking to kind of form that vision for how to do data and analytics, and how to generate more value from data. So it's no surprise who the typical culprit behind these kinds of transformations is. It's the CDO, but not really any kind of CDO. We recognize that there really are 2 main classes of CDO, one who acts in more of a consultative capacity, developing data strategies and and initiating data governance efforts. This kind of CDO more frequently reports to the CIO or maybe the COO. The other class of CDO is actually an executive who truly is responsible and accountable for all things data in the organization. Often this person is reporting to the CEO or at least with a spot on the executive team. Fewer than 40% of CDOs are in this category. Yet organizations with this kind of executive level CDO, truly an executive, the one with the resources, the influence, and the authority, we found that they are 4 times more likely to be using data to transform the business. But what about organizations where the CIO remains the ultimate responsibility for the company's data assets? Well, we find that they're less likely to be doing things like advanced analytics. Why? I think this is because in organizations without empowered CDOs, data quality and availability continue to be significant impediments to analytics. So let's talk about data democratization. We often hear business leaders talk about this topic, but what does it really mean? Many of you, I'm sure, know Bernard Marr. He has a real kind of succinct, well, not necessarily succinct, but probably really good definition that's as good as any. He says it's that everybody has access to data. There are no gatekeepers that create a bottleneck to the data. It requires that we accompany the access with an easy way for people to understand the data so that they can use it to expedite decision making and uncover opportunities for the organization, and that the goal is to have anybody use data at any time to make decisions with no barriers to access or understanding. A bit mouthy, but you get the idea. So if the goal is for data to be shared freely throughout the organization, it first has to be considered an asset, not just talked about as one. Unfortunately, the study indicates that fewer than 20% of companies really treat data as an asset by applying actual asset management principles and practices, as we talked about on the last talk. Yet here we are in the midst of the information age, and everyone knows the power of data, but still the vast majority of companies are sitting in the 20th century and really haven't made the necessary cultural shift. It shouldn't be that difficult. Most companies follow a strict asset management discipline for their other assets, as I mentioned earlier, their financial assets and physical assets and even human capital. So why can't we adapt these kinds of standards and frameworks and procedures toward the management of information assets? I think perhaps it's because again, as I mentioned last time, data is not a balance sheet asset, or maybe because we IT folks just love inventing new methods more than we do adapting existing ones. I'm not sure. So again, no surprise, we see organizations with CDOs being 3 times as likely to be sharing data freely among individuals and departments than those with no CDO. I mean, how else are you going to establish any kind of necessary mandates and policies and procedures and make the cultural shifts? I'm sorry, that's just not going to happen with only a CDO. CDOs have had a couple of decades to make that happen, and they really kind of haven't. And it's not going to happen with like a director or manager level, head of data warehousing. So I think an executive role is certainly warranted. So we've talked about culture change being one of the main drivers of becoming so-called data-driven. The build a data warehouse or data lake and they will come approach has failed over and over, yet business people are craving data. We hear this time and time again on client engagements. So let's take a look at some of the factors that are kind of holding them back. Starting at the bottom is a bit of a shocker here, as we used to say in Australia. 1/3 of those surveyed believe data is a balance sheet asset. It certainly should be. It qualifies as one. It's owned and controlled. It's exchangeable for cash and generates probable future economic benefits. That's the definition of an asset. And it's separable from other assets, but alas, it's not considered an asset, only with a couple of rare exceptions. We also have a bit of you see here, a data producer consumer disconnect leading to data literacy issues. First, a large swath of people don't even know who's using the data they produce or what they're using it for. If you're generating data without any purview or much purview into how it's being used, then you're probably not producing it in a way that makes it that usable. Moreover, if neither you as the producer of data nor anyone else are cataloging or describing that data, then it's not discoverable or understandable or even very trustable. Is that a word? Trustworthy, that's the word. Finally, we see some growth in the adoption and training on analytic tools beyond spreadsheets the past couple of years. But again, this really isn't near where it needs to be for an organization to even approach being data-driven or optimizing its use of data and analytics. This isn't from our study. It's really just kind of from our experience at West Monroe. One of the dozens of companies that have approached us about of the dozens of companies that have approached us about establishing data literacy programs the past year, every one of these requests and conversations were exclusively from and with CDOs, not CIOs. And I would imagine, Peter, you might be able to kind of confirm that. This isn't to say that achieving high levels of data literacy or fluency throughout a company isn't possible without a CDO. It's just that we just don't see that happening at all. So assuming it takes a CDO to get these kinds of programs off the ground, would you really want to forego a concerted effort in a fast digitizing economy like this? I certainly wouldn't if I were king of the kingdom. So not one of my favorite topics, and you heard me talk at length about this, monetizing data. Most of my work the past several years has been involved with businesses to help them develop new and innovative value streams from their data. As I talked about last time, this doesn't necessarily mean selling their data, but rather deploying it in a variety of ways, both internally and externally. Remember, I've long argued that data is not the new oil. I talked about that last time. Also, data has these unique economic characteristics that oil doesn't. Data is what economists would call a non-rivalrous, non-depleting, and regenerative asset. That is, you can use it simultaneously for multiple purposes. You can use it again and again, and when you do use it, it doesn't get used up. And typically generates more data whenever you're using it. So companies whose leaders get this concept, whether they do so explicitly or just intuitively, are the ones that are really winning or poised to win in their industry. Let's examine the state of affairs when it comes to generating data-driven value streams. Again, that's my overall definition of data monetization. The good news is, I suppose, is that about half of organizations believe they're finding ways to monetize their data externally. 10% licensed to others, a few more exchange data in return for goods and services or other commercial considerations like discounts. And finally, we see that fewer than a third of companies say they're generating value from their data in a multitude of ways. You may be familiar with the New Vantage study that Randy Bean and company produced. We saw that earlier in the year, and this indicates that only about 12% of CDOs have revenue responsibility, which kind of begs an interesting question. Without revenue responsibility, why would a CDO make monetizing data a priority? And imagine how far behind the curve any business is when they haven't figured out how to wield data like cash. These are probably the ones with business leaders who look at the company's balance sheet and don't realize that they're looking at something defined in the 1930s that's largely unchanged since then, a ubiquitous document that somehow convinces them that data isn't really an asset and therefore shouldn't be leveraged as one. But that's the soapbox I'm usually on. But here's a real eye-opener. Organizations with a true CDO executive are 7 times more likely to be generating cash by sharing or selling their data externally. Again, we're not talking 7% or 70%. This is 700% more. Moreover, these kinds of companies are 3 times more likely to be generating other forms of commercial value by externalizing their data assets. No disrespect to CIOs. They have a thankless and insanely difficult job, but they seem to continue to either disregard the potential economic value of companies' data or just have too many other priorities, like keeping the lights on and the discs spinning. One of the 3 cornerstones of infonomics that I've covered before is that of measuring data's value. And one of my original hypotheses was that most companies don't manage data particularly well, certainly not with the discipline in which they manage their other assets. And that's because they're not measuring it in any way. You can't manage what you don't measure. And we all get totally geeked out over big data and how big it is, or at least we did the last decade. But we IT geeks were really measuring the wrong thing. If we had paid the least amount of attention to how other assets are measured, we would have been leading efforts to measure data's various quality characteristics, its potential economic value, its business relevancy, its cost, its impact on business performance, its market value, and top and bottom line impact on the organization. But no, we had to fixate on terabytes and gigabytes instead. Our failure to measure anything much about data, let alone the most important economic factors, have led to, I believe, to insufficient budgets and resources for doing things like data quality, master data management, metadata management, building data warehouses and data lakes, or integrating external data sources. So here we go. These are downright daunting numbers. Think about your organization's main asset, whether it's a product or a financial investment or some service that you offer. Now in your mind, replace the word data throughout this slide, okay, with that asset. Okay, so think about that for a second. I'll make it easier for you. So now consider, if you were responsible for that asset, that product or service or whatever, and you were one of the 89% of the companies that didn't know its cost basis, or one of the 88% of the companies that had absolutely no value assessment for that asset, or one of the 79% of companies that didn't gauge its quality, how long would you keep your job? This is what a friend of mine, KPMG managing partner Stan Rosenthal, refers to as a kind of gross negligence that's rampant throughout the business world. Or imagine you're involved in a merger or acquisition, and the private equity firm or VC or accounting firm that you're working with has a due diligence process that completely ignores the value of the acquiree's data assets as part of the transaction. This is actually what I found in assessing over a dozen different due diligence methodologies from household name private equity and accounting firms. Rather than asking these firms, our clients work with, do you know what century this is? I work with them to develop what I've called a data diligence methodology that easily bolts onto existing due diligence approaches to measure data's potential value, its market value, its quality characteristics, and dozen other factors of value, cost, risk, and synergies among the two parties. Some companies have found that they're significantly undervalued once they've actually evaluated their data assets. Case in point, you may have seen that United Airlines and American Airlines, I wrote about this in a Forbes piece over the summer. Recently, their businesses, which were stricken by the pandemic, both United Airlines and American looked through the cushions to kind of figure out what they had to sell or otherwise leverage to stay afloat, to take out loans. And what did they find? They both secured multi-billion-dollar loans by collateralizing their Mileage Plus and Advantage, customer loyalty programs. One might think, why didn't they collateralize their planes? Well, the planes are leased, so you really can't collateralize them. But catch this: the third-party appraisals of their data suggest that it's worth 2 to 3 times more than the market value of the companies themselves. 2 to 3 times more than the entire market value of the companies themselves. United's customer data was valued at $20 billion, while the market cap at the time was $9 billion. Similarly, American's data was valued at a minimum of about $19 billion and up to a jaw-dropping $31 billion, whereas its own market cap was hovering at less than $8 billion. So, your value of your company's data might even be worth more than the company itself in certain circumstances. So CDOs may be, unwittingly, therefore, the caretakers of the company's most valuable data asset. It's valuable asset. It's data, but nobody's going to know this if you don't measure it. And I guess you could want the company to be on the ropes, like the airlines were. But why wait? The study found a bit of sunshine on this topic, in that organizations with executive level CDOs are 3 to 4 times more likely to formally evaluate the company's data assets. Unfortunately, without the CDO being an executive team peer of the CFO, this doesn't seem to happen any more often than it would otherwise without a CDO. I think I'm going to get to the investment community here. So just in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over some stuff on data quality. There's some really interesting data in the study about data quality and the impact CDOs have. But let's get to the investment community, and then I want to save time for some questions. While private equity firms, VCs, and so forth may continue to entirely overlook the value of a company's data assets and the deals that they do, investors and markets, however, are another matter altogether. So let's take a look at that. So while they may not measure the value of a company's data assets, markets do favor data savvy companies in a big way. When we looked at the various financial indicators of companies that demonstrate certain data savvy or data driven behaviors, like hiring a CDO or setting up a data governance program and hiring a team of data scientists, these kinds of behaviors are becoming more mainstream for sure, but I found that these kinds of companies have a market to book value, or more specifically for you quants out there, a Tobin's Q ratio that's nearly 2 times higher than the average publicly traded company. Again, we're not talking about 2% or 20%, we're talking 200% higher relative valuation. Again, the causal relationship is less certain, but there's no doubt that there's something about these kinds of companies that investors really dig. And then for good measure, no pun intended, I separated out companies that make a living by selling data, or where data or digital goods are their primary offering, some kind of data derivative. So here we found that markets favor these kinds of companies in terms of their valuation by 3 to 1 over the average company. So in all my years of research at Gartner and afterward, I don't think there's any, I've never seen or produced a more compelling argument for embracing data savvy kinds of behaviors or developing data or digital solutions than the need for a data executive to formulate and lead them. And to be more precise, what we're looking at are companies that have enterprise data governance functions. They have data science organizations and data science and chief data officers. Finally, and then we'll have plenty of time for some discussion here. And if you want me, I'll go back to the data quality stuff. Dozens of CDOs and CIOs have met with say that they started getting these kinds of questions from their boards or senior executives. Questions like, how are you treating data like any other asset, or what is the value of our company's data, or how are we generating new value streams? But my advice would be to become very prepared to answer these kinds of inquiries. Even in a CDO job interviews, I'm coaching some individuals on, they've been hearing these kinds of questions in the form of, how would you, or how do you intend to? In short, and I'll kind of talk about infonomics again, if you want to make information really part of your corporate strategy, I think this kind of all goes together like this. It really starts with measuring your data, measuring its potential value, its actual value, identifying ways to monetize it better, and of course managing it as an actual asset enables you to do that. Those of you who are interested in the book, here's a little bit of background on the book. Some nice things that some people have said that aren't my family, and then I'd say just in short, if you want your organization to really make data part of its enterprise strategy, to transform the business with data, to democratize data better, to raise the level of data fluency, to monetize data better, to measure its value, not just to improve quality and governance, enable improved deployment of advanced analytics, and of course impress investors, then it would certainly seem a good idea not just to hire a CDO, but hire an executive level CDO. So there we go. That's that. And I'm happy to take some questions, or Peter, if you'd like me to go back, I can share some of the findings on data quality if you like.
Let me take you through a couple of things. First of all, great stuff,
Sure.
Doug.
Thanks.
It's so unusual to get somebody that can put effort out to do. You said you had 500 businesses already included in this, and that it was an ongoing process. And I can't tell you the number of hurdles I'd have to go through as a university professor to even ask people questions, you know, the IRB stuff and all that you encounter from
Oh,
those
yeah,
things.
yeah.
But it seems that the first takeaway from this, in my mind, and again, we are a society of CDOs here, is that if we're not naming it, it doesn't actually happen, right? It's
Yeah.
sort of this, I hate to make it quite that simple, but, you know, as you've got here on the slide, hire or appoint somebody that's in charge of the data, because right now, nobody's in charge, and how's that working out for you is you know, usually the question that I ask.
Well,
So when we name a CDO, I think that there's another question on this. And you were very clear at the beginning, you're not trying to imply cause and effect with this, you're just noting correlations. And there are some very strong correlations in what you have here. And I'd love to be able to take this into the university environment and try to do a little bit more with it. Maybe that's a conversation we can have offline.
I would love to do that, to explore that. And I could use that in my university class as well.
Absolutely. So what is it that you think has been happening up to this point? I'm waiting for our audience to pull some questions into the chat here while we do this. But what is it that you think that has caused organizations to? I'm having a very bad question writing moment here, Doug. I'm sorry.
It's all right.
Lots of people appreciate data at an intuitive sense, but there's something
Right.
about actually naming it that is critical. And I wonder if you could talk about that for just a minute, based on your consulting experience, based on your communication experience as a Gartner analyst, all the other things that you have. What is it that's so important about naming data that makes it actually start to happen?
It's I think what you're asking is why has this been a challenge?
Yeah.
Get to this point. You know, at some level, data is assumed, right? It's just kind of assumed that it flows and it does its thing. It's derivative to other business assets that are much more tangible and that we're much more familiar and comfortable with. There is, you know, data is much more amorphous and fluvius, I think is the word. And then here's another challenge, and I didn't put this in the material. I probably should. Another study that I ran was I had this hypothesis that, and you and I both teach in university, and so I had this hypothesis that universities are teaching students how to do analytics, but not how to manage data. And so I actually surveyed 300 top MBA programs around the world and found that something like 97% of them have a course in data analytics, but no course whatsoever in information management. And so we're continuing to graduate a whole new generation, or cohort as we call them, right? Generation of future business executives who know how to manage products and people and numbers, but not how to manage data. And that doesn't speak very well for any organization who's trying to really manage and leverage data as an actual asset. So I would blame, you know, the universities to some degree. Thankfully, the University of Illinois has you know, picked up this infonomics concept and is offering the course to its MBA students, its Masters of Accounting students, and others. So, but really, there are very few courses in other than maybe knowledge management that exist in MBA programs around the world. And so, even long answer, but yeah.
I was going to say, but even when we look at knowledge management, that's not really the basics of it. I mean, if we go back to what are the basic problems with data science at this point, there's sort of three of them. First of all, they're not productive enough. Second of all, they have no sense of what the business needs. And third of all, they really don't have any understanding, as you said, of how to do the basics of what they need to do. So every data scientist out there will tell you, I spend 80% of my time munging the data.
Finding data, yeah.
It turns out that leads to a really nice formula, which is that if you have, you know, 5 data scientists, you probably need to have a data engineer there to work closely with them and help them get the data ready for their analysis.
Absolutely, yep.
So
you don't want your high-paid data scientist to be spending time finding and integrating data sources.
Which is what they spend 80% of their time doing. But that's getting us off track here. So
and that's a quick way to lose a data scientist too. If they have to do that for your business, then they're going to go somewhere else where they don't have to do that.
Ooh, good point on that one as well. So what you've essentially done here, though, is pointed out that there's an awful lot of things that are happening in the world, a bunch of really good data points, and those involve organizations that have mentioned and made a specific focus around data, and that has resulted in a lot more tangible things that are out there. No,
Right.
we don't necessarily know that these are cause and effect, but they are certainly coincident and obviously being able to happen at the same time. And I just think there's a lot more here that we could push out. I'm curious what our audience thinks in terms of what are the barriers to you all getting this type of an access and being able to understand where are the various bits and pieces from. Got a couple questions that are popping in here. Doug, one did ask a question about quality of data for CDOs, and I'm not sure whether they mean the data that the CDOs are working on or the data about the CDOs, because I'm sure you've seen a bunch of variation in CDO capabilities as well, Doug.
Yeah, is this the question around the job requirements for a CDO?
I think so.
Yeah, I mean, that's ridiculous to see CDOs who have programming skills. Goodness gracious, I would never. I mean, unless you want the title, great, but I would not want to get into that role at all. That's crazy. So requirement for leadership or management skills. Yeah, that's a really poorly articulated chief data officer role. If it doesn't mention the need for leadership and change management, those are the primary, definitely the primary soft skills. Yeah.
And we don't even teach those to MBA students, going back to our respective, parts of our jobs of teaching, right?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, change management probably is something that it's addressed in some coursework, but in leadership classes, but yeah.
It's mentioned, but I don't know that anybody has any skills in that area. I've got several books. I know some consultants that specialize in that. Why is, here's another question, Doug, that pops in. Why is it that it needs to be an executive versus a non-executive in your mind?
Because executives can get things done. They have budget, they have resources. If you're just a CDO light, like I call them, then maybe you're able to influence strategy a little bit. But ultimately you don't have the authority or responsibility or the accountability. If you have accountability without responsibility and authority, again, that's a job that you don't want to have.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Been there and done that one.
Right.
When you look at this, when we're talking about how important do you think data literacy is going to be to CDOs in general? I'll step back and ask you another question after that.
Yeah, well, a CDO should have the highest level of data literacy probably of anybody in the organization, and then put in place programs to raise data literacy among other executives, and then down through the organization. So that's, I think, becoming a primary responsibility for CDOs.
So then part of the CDO's role is to get the rest of the organization more literate around data concepts.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Absolutely. All right. And given that, I think that most organizations aren't necessarily thinking that that's a role that their CDO should be. It should really be to monitor, what they're looking at is, I want to go back after that several $1 billion you told me is sitting in the airline's cushions, right? The couch cushions and things. There's just some wonderful opportunities there to get that. And you knocked it out of the park on that one, right?
Yeah, but to realize that vision, to identify the value. I'm actually working with a company that said, yeah, we want to run these data monetization workshops that you do, Doug, but we need to raise our level of data literacy among the executives who are going to be involved in those workshops first. And so, we're putting in place a data literacy program, and then going to run the workshops. They say it just won't work well if we have a bunch of people in the room who don't understand the possibilities of data, the art of the possible, the challenges with data, what kind of data that we have, where does it come from, where does it go, how does it flow. They need to understand all of that at some level before they can be a real active and valuable participant in any kind of ideation workshop.
So necessary to have the executives be literate before they can start making decisions about data.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they'll do something. My favorite example these days is, oh, so you put your Salesforce.com software in and then filled it all up with bad data, and now you wonder why people don't like Salesforce. Not
Exactly.
Salesforce.
Right. Yeah. Where customer data goes to die. Yeah.
I wouldn't go that far on them.
In some organizations.
In some organizations, there you go. Do you think investors are really getting this piece there? I mean, you've already said that the bidding on these companies, the market cap on these companies is going very, very high relative to this. So are people trolling through the K1 forms and looking for companies that have this on a programmatic basis at this point, or do you think it's more of a anecdotal kind of thing?
I think it's probably more anecdotal, but I wouldn't be surprised if some really forward-looking hedge funds are analyzing investor reports. I already know that some do text analysis on investor reports looking for certain things. This might be something that they would look for. How often is data mentioned? How often is analytics mentioned? Just for starters, would be really interesting analysis to do. Hey, there's a study that we can do, Peter.
Absolutely. I was reminded of the West Wing episode where you're trying to figure out what goes into the the State of the Union message, right? And there's a lot of politics around putting those K1s together and putting them in there. If people around there are not talking about data, it's a problem. Here's another question.
So. Yeah.
What do you think about the business case for this? Do you think it's a strong one at this point? I'm kind of leading it there because I think I know what your answer is.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's entirely strong, but we need to, organizations need to know how to make that business case a little bit better. And I think part of it is as who posted that question earlier? Let me see who that was. Mike. That the role is still perhaps not as well defined as like a CFO's role or a CIO's role or a CHRO's role or even a COO's role. We need to do a better job of kind of defining the chief data officer role and making it something that's pretty standard. It'll take time, but it'll happen. But yeah, programming, coding skills, no.
And then yet you and I are old enough to know that we used to make our MBA students do that, right?
Yeah.
We'd sit down and say, hey, we're going to teach you basic coding so you'll know what all those people in IT are doing.
Listen, it's good to know, right? It's having a coding background certainly is helpful to understand and appreciate the challenges of data and the flow of information and analytics. There's no doubt about that. In fact, my son, who's taking computer science classes, I'm like, why are you taking computer science? You're not going to become a programmer. He goes, I want to learn how to manage programmers. So it's like, okay, that's the right answer.
Cool.
Yeah,
good answer. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So here's another question pops in, Doug. Given that somebody's a new CDO in an organization, where should they start? What is the bit that's, do you want to start going around and focusing on that K1 form and starting to put that stuff out there so that you'll appear in those types of companies? Or are there more substantive things that we can get to?
I didn't understand both of those parts of the question how they fit together. Can you do that again?
Yeah. So a new CDO is showing up in a company. They've decided they're going to take the plunge of listening to Doug and saying, Doug says business executive leadership is going to be important in the area of data. What do they do first?
Well, I mean, tactically, you really need to inventory the company's data assets. A lot of it starts with just knowing what you have and what you don't have, and then analyzing what kind of shape it's in from a quality perspective, and then looking at what is the relative or actual contribution of those data assets to business value. And very quickly, you'll identify where data assets are underutilized, and maybe why they're underutilized, because they're not trusted. You don't have metadata, or the data quality is poor. So I would kind of start there, but at the same time, that's more the defense side. As I think Tom Davenport and some others talk about the CDO's role in terms of defense and offense. Mm-hmm. Then there's the offense side. Be out there working with the business to identify new ways to generate data-driven value streams. I think the CDOs that are going to be successful and have a longer tenure are ones that balance both that offense and defense really, really well.
Sure. Got another question coming in here. I'll read this one because I'm trying to interpret the others and I'm doing a bad job of it, so I'll just read this one straightforward here. I see there are a lot of CDOs now changing their titles to CDAO. I'm a bit worried because analytics is a very different from what the typical CDO is supposed to do. What is your take on this, Doug?
It's a demonstration that an organization wants to raise analytics to enterprise level importance, and that it's not something that the CIO can do. So I get it, and I don't really have a problem with it. But yeah, managing data and setting up an analytics, an enterprise analytics function and capability are really different jobs. Yeah, but there's no reason that a single executive can't oversee both of those.
Certainly at first, anyway, until it gets to be big and you've done some.
And then
results.
You have a VP or a director of analytics that's focusing on setting up an analytics center of excellence and dealing with analytic governance, and maybe even selecting tools, and maybe even dealing with the analytics side of data literacy to better enable self-service analytics throughout the organization. Somebody who is experimenting with AI and advanced analytics. That would all be that side of the equation. And there's no reason that a CDAO can't do all of that, but you need some strong lieutenants under that individual.
And I'm going to take a bit of liberty here, Doug, and try to put some words in your mouth. I'm going to bet that you're going to agree that you should probably have a data person, and that you can have an analytics person. But if you have an analytics person without a data person, it's probably not the best.
Yeah, exceptions to every rule, but yeah, they definitely go hand in hand for sure. Doing analytics without having control of your data or having well managed data is going to be very tough. Yep, and similarly, doing data management without any investment in how that data is going to be leveraged is also
tough.
Becomes a cost sink, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You mentioned a couple times data inventory. I have a saying that I've told people for years and years, because I've never seen any company on the planet ever finish a data inventory. And I do believe that's a true statement. But at the same time, what is it that will allow them to have enough of an inventory that they can then start to do the rest of the things that they need to do, if data inventory is the starting place for a new CDO?
Well, you can start with if you have an enterprise data model of some kind, you can start with that. So doing an inventory down to a field level is nice to have, but at least having it at an entity level is important. And then placing the metadata on it is makes it that much more usable and trustworthy. Or focus on scope. Let's say let's just start with our customer data and inventory everything that we have about our customers, or inventory everything that we know about our products. So focus on the entities that are probably the most mission critical.
Absolutely.
We had that issue with Boeing when we worked with them, and they said we have 6 million data elements that we figured out. And there are scanners from companies like Global IDs and others that can scan your environment to identify all the data that exists. And they said, listen, we have so much data, we can't manage it all equally. And so we help them identify which data has the greatest potential economic value to the organization, and is perhaps underutilized. And they use that to make some decisions about where to focus their data management efforts.
And of course, what you're describing here too, Doug, is a level of self-knowledge about the data. So we all know the adage in marketing: half of all marketing expenditures are useless. We just don't know which half. And we certainly know that most corporate data is not analyzed, but we're not sure which has been and which hasn't. And this is, of course, where the glossary and things come in. How do you see the CDO rolling into governance types of activities for organization?
Well, I think data governance and analytic governance belong under the CDO. Where the connective tissue is with things like privacy. You might have a chief privacy officer separate from a CDO. You might have an executive over information security, and so that's where they need to coordinate. I'm not really a fan of putting information security under the CDO. I think there's a lot of technical aspects to that. that really still belong under the CIO. But
well, it's kind of hard to have a role that says make data
general
more useful in the organization, at the same time keep people from using it,
Mhm.
right?
Right.
The dualness of the role is very, very confusing. I've seen that occur in a bunch of organizations that have not, I think, done well around that.
And I think a CDO needs to think more in terms of data enablement and proper and controlled, well-governed data enablement rather than clamping down on data access.
I think I saw something just yesterday on the role of ethics too. How do you feel ethics should be dealt with from a CDO perspective?
Great question, especially when it comes to the way that data is leveraged. Any new idea for deploying data, whether it's analytics or otherwise, ought to go through some kind of ethical assessment. Identifying the untoward ways that somebody might leverage that data, what happens if it escapes into the wild, again, what are ways that it could be misused, and that should be part of any. We actually do make that at West Monroe part of our data monetization process. Is after the ideas have been generated by these workshops, we take them through an assessment process where we look at their economic feasibility, their managerial, operational feasibility, the data quality feasibility, the data availability feasibility, ethical and legal feasibility of all the ideas that are generated. So it should be a key part. And then even some companies have designated or hired a digital ethicist, we've seen. It's a topic that my colleague at Gartner, Frank Boutendijk, was a real thought leader on.
You have to grab him for a future webinar at some point.
Yeah, he'd be great. He's very entertaining.
Well, Doug, I don't see any more questions. I give everybody just another minute to pop up here. If you wanted to jump back in and highlight a couple of points or anything on there before we break.
Yeah, no, it's good. Just some things on data quality. We found that 18% of respondents believe that data quality is a major cultural focus of their organization, which is a real problem. 50% do measure data quality to some degree, so that's kind of good. But 3/4 of respondents claim that throughout their organizations, people regularly argue about whose data is right. I don't know how a company can hope to execute efficiently or make consistent decisions with that kind of situation. Let's not blame data quality altogether for this. I think part of the issue is the sprawl of spreadsheets containing data extracts or spread marts, as our friend Wayne Eckerson calls them. So, so I think data quality is a big issue. I think it's no surprise to any of us, but making the business case for enterprise data governance and an executive to lead it, i.e. the CDO, is important. The things about data quality is not necessarily about data quality issues. It's about the debilitating ones that really impair the business, and you need to identify what those are.
Absolutely. We did get a couple more questions here, Doug, before we sign off, so I don't want to miss out.
No worries.
How do we as CDOs impress our investors? What a good business-oriented question, right? How do we impress our investors?
One is by showing them the value, the current cost basis of the data assets. Start creating even though you can't create an auditable balance sheet, you definitely should create a supplemental balance sheet for the value of your data assets and show how they're being deployed and the plans for deploying those data assets in new and innovative ways. That would impress investors a lot.
Make sure I understand that. So this is a supplemental document that wouldn't be necessarily turned in as part of the accounting package, but nevertheless tracked.
Yeah.
So sort of a shadow set of books.
Yeah, in annual reports, companies report on things like their ESG posture, their sustainability, their diversity, things like that are not, required by the accounting industry, but impress investors. I would say do the same sort of thing related to your data assets.
Very cool. Another question here. Would you agree that data privacy is being placed in the CDO wheelhouse is also not advisable, as is with data security? I think you answered that.
Yeah, not necessarily in the wheelhouse. There we probably should have it, and I think GDPR mandates a chief data privacy officer. So having somebody at that level who is ultimately responsible and accountable for privacy, and then the CDO, really would be more about kind of implementing those policies.
I think this questioner is asking, where would the responsibilities, the privacy responsibilities, lie in that case?
Well, it's a joint responsibility. I think the responsibility of developing the privacy regulations, and you ought to lie with a chief privacy officer or someone at a VP, senior VP level. And privacy is really difficult because privacy it varies by industry, by culture, by country, by industry. It's challenging, and it's a bit more than I think the CDO alone can bite off.
I think we've got time for one more question here. I'm glad we can get it in.
All right.
How much of an argument is there for speed as a benefit from quality governed data? Organizations have different values, and for those who really value moving fast, some are opposed to governance but don't realize the benefits for velocity when the data can be simply trusted. Are you aware of any documented evidence studies looking at this benefit? I'm simply
going to agree with that statement and say that that is something that is worth further study. Yeah. Where has governance inhibited the flexibility or agility of an organization? That would be something really interesting to study.
And there is a good... Sorry,
go ahead.
There's a little interesting case study that Capital One put out a couple of years ago where they had overcorrected towards too much governance, and they took some lessons and very publicly said the good things about it. Yeah.
There's a great research being done by, again, back at Gartner, by Ted Friedman, published I think one of the best research notes in recent memory on the topic of data governance. And he's introducing this concept of agile data governance. And it's really, it's non-obvious, but it's really good work. So I would encourage you to check it out.
Well, I think we've reached the top of the hour here, Doug. Again, as usual, just fascinating, full of facts and things. And most importantly, I'm going to say, we had lots of press come out recently saying we're feeling more hopeful these days because we may be over the top of the virus curve in some areas and things like that. Yeah. You're leaving me a little hopeful in this area here as well. And I'll certainly look forward to more conversations with you. And of course, when your book comes out, that'll be a wonderful excuse to come back here and talk to us some more.
Make that available to everybody in the society.
Super.
All right.
Doug, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate this. We will get the recording out for everybody and the slides, and look forward to seeing you all next month on our regular scheduled podcast webinar. What is the difference between podcast and webinar, Doug?
Thanks, Doug. Thanks, Peter.
Cheers.
Okay.